Hello everyone and welcome to my April 2024 reading wrap-up. In the month of April, I read 16 books, 3,687 pages. I averaged a 3.75 star review and read about 70% nonfiction to 30% fiction. I mostly focused a lot of my nonfiction reading between history and art, and I think I had a fantastic month, so I'm going to talk about what I read in both the fiction and nonfiction categories and what I thought about each one. I'm also going to include books that I did not post a book review on, so stay tuned, and if any of the books I say in this video I explicitly mention as being reviewed, there's a review for it on my channel. So let's dive in and talk about the books that I read in April and what I thought about them. So in fiction this month, I only read 4 fiction books, and I usually overall over the course of a year have a very even split between nonfiction and fiction, but I do have standout months where I read a lot of nonfiction or a lot of fiction, so I do swing and oscillate throughout the year. So this month I only read 4 fiction books, however 2 of those were over 400 pages, so I was not slouching necessarily in the fiction section. I just was on some momentum waves in the nonfiction category. So I'm going to discuss what I read. The first one is Murder at Havens Rock, which was #1 in the Havens Rock series by Kelly Armstrong. Technically, I listened to this as an audiobook format, and I think I was just expecting something different. This was a mystery, but it was not a cozy mystery, which is the kind I usually go for. And as I listened to the book, I kind of had this assumption that there was a supernatural aspect, so maybe a fantasy aspect, and that was not true at all. So I did not really know where I got that idea from, but I had mismatched expectations going into the book, and so it was just okay. I felt like the main characters were rather unrealistic in this book, and I do have a review explaining all my faults with this book. This would be probably my least reviewed or lowest reviewed book. I gave it under 3 stars. I think I gave it like 2.5. So I did not find this very enjoyable, and I think I only finished it because it was an audiobook and I could listen to it while washing the dishes. But everything else I read this month was pretty good. So that was just kind of the only standout bad one, and occasionally you get those. Next up is Management Style of the Supreme Beings by Tom Holtz. This is my 3rd book by this author, but the other 2 books I read were written under his other name, KJ Parker. This was a humorous style in the style maybe of Christopher Moore, maybe a little more sanitized than him, but I thought it was quite funny. It described if the corporate world was combined with the afterlife and management of the universe, and I thought that it was a very enjoyable little read. I felt like the ending could maybe use a little bit of work, but overall it was quite fun. The next one is Prosper's Demons. So this was by KJ Parker, but KJ Parker is Tom Holtz, so the author of the Management Style of the Supreme Beings. I do find I really enjoy his writing style for all his faults. I do tend to rate his books quite highly, and I enjoy them, so I'm going to keep reading them. And this was more of a novella-length book, so quite short. And finally, The Clinic by Kate Quinn. So this is a book that I do not have a review for on my channel. It follows an individual who learns that her sister was her sister died in a rehabilitation clinic, and the sister of the woman believes that she was killed in the clinic due to the nature of her death. So she checks herself into the rehab to both treat her own issues with addiction as well as discover her sister's cause of death. This book had a very long holds list, and there was a lot of people waiting for it at the library. I am a library reader, and I didn't have time, so I was reading it, but I wasn't taking notes, which was my mistake. And when I reached the end, I realized I would probably have to keep it out for another day or 2 to take thorough notes to write a review for it for my channel, and I'd rather just return it because I knew there was a long list of people on hold. So I just decided to forego the review and turn it into the library. I did enjoy it quite a bit. I do think, and I don't mean any disrespect with this, I feel like it's the kind of book that's written for people who don't normally read, which there's definitely a market for that. It's very quick and it reads fast. It reads quickly, that's what I'll say. And it reads like a book that maybe people who aren't necessarily readers would also read and enjoy. And there's a market for that. And that doesn't mean it's an inferior book. I just think there are books that maybe would appeal to people who haven't read a lot, and something like The Clinic would fall into that category. So just for fiction. Now let's dive into my nonfiction, which was quite a bit bigger, and I'm going to try to lump categories together that may be similar just to keep things on track. I actually read 3 books on math this month, which is quite good. I try to read 1 book on math a week, but that doesn't always happen, mostly because I've almost exhausted my library's math collection, even though I'm in quite a big library district. So I have to do interlibrary holds, which take a while. So the first was Math, 100 Ideas in 100 Words. This is one of those books that attempts to go through the entire field of mathematics, find the big ideas, distill them into a small bite-sized chunk, and provide them to the public for popular consumption. This book I feel like moved quite a bit faster than I expected, but I still enjoyed it and I thought it was a really great read. Next was Mathematics for Human Flourishing. This was by Frances Su. This was a book that discussed the role math can play in your life and the benefits of learning math, but not just from like a STEM perspective, more from a philosophical perspective, and I wound up really, really enjoying it. It was my highest rated book this month, and I loved it. I think it's a must read for anyone, whether or not you've had a good experience with math. I think Mathematics for Human Flourishing was really well done. Next in the math, and the final math one that I read, was Topology, a very short introduction. This is in the very short introduction series. I read this because I have a personal interest in studying topology. It was something I didn't study in my course of college. I do have a degree in math, so I'm familiar with a lot of the concepts in it, but it wasn't something I formally studied, and I wanted to formally study it. Well, not maybe formally in the university sense, but on my own. I want to self-study it. So I decided to start with this very short introduction. It was fine. I think I also read a book last month called Euler's Gem. Well, I don't think I read it. I did read that book. I'm not sure of the timing. That just introduced topology much better in a much more interesting fashion. So I feel like having read Euler's Gem, I had kind of spoiled myself for Topology, a very short introduction. That being said, that book review performed way better on my channel than expected. Sometimes it surprises me what people watch on my channel. I did not realize there was such a market for people looking for a very short introduction to Topology book review, but I was quite surprised with that. Next, I read some books that kind of discussed the medieval life, medieval thought, medieval art, starting with Monsters and Grotesques in Medieval Manuscripts. This was a really interesting look at the depiction of those creatures in medieval manuscripts. I also read Faces of Power and Piety by Eric Inglis. This was a book on how portraits were portrayed in medieval art. I thought it was really, really fascinating and I had a great time reading it. Both Monsters and Grotesques and Faces of Power and Piety. So I do have reviews of those, and they were quite short books, but there's quite a lot of information in it. So I feel like sometimes my page count might look really low for a month, but that's because I spent 2 days going over a 60-page book because there's just so much content in it. And I do not believe in rushing or pushing or forcing yourself to read or like trying to find short books to meet a reading goal or anything. That just seems silly to me. I just read what I enjoy and want to read, and we'll see if I hit my reading goal. But sometimes those short books are not necessarily short because there's a lot of content to cover in it. Then I also read Trolls in Unnatural History. This was by John Lindau. So this book discussed trolls in folklore mythology, the Nordic creatures. So it was quite fun, enjoyable. I really enjoyed some of the art that was included within it. Speaking of art, I read one book called Shinhanga, New Prints in Modern Japan. This was by Kendall Brown. Well, it had multiple essays in it, but 2 of the 3 essays were by Kendall Brown, so they had the main billing. And this discussed Shinhanga, an art movement in Japan that followed the ukiyo-e art movement, or the woodblock prints that we're very familiar with, so masters like Hakusai. But the Shinhanga prints I actually really enjoy, and they've kind of been dismissed throughout art history as being an inferior copy of what came before. But this book did a really good job of explaining its own uniqueness, and I do not think they are inferior. I had a great time looking through this book. Additionally, in the art, we go all the way back to another time frame, paleo art, and this was Dinosaur Art 2, which was edited by Steve White. The, I assume, editor found 10 artists who do paleo art, so art of dinosaurs, and they interviewed them, and they put their interviews along with some of their portfolio in a book. Super fun, great, check my review out, it's fantastic art. Next, I read a true crime one. True crime isn't really my cup of tea, but the only time I like it is when there is a bigger story. I feel like sometimes true crime can be very, it can be, I don't know if sensationalized is the right word. People read it for entertainment and ultimately like there's something horrible that happened, so I just kind of feel weird about it. But I think it can be done respectfully and well, so we do want to say that. Sometimes there's a point and a purpose to it. In this case, Failure of Justice by John Ferak was the book that I read, and it discussed a false conviction and false testimony that was obtained by police officers in Nebraska in the attempt to find a killer in a small town. I thought it was a fascinating book. It was quite hard to read at times, and there was a lot of graphic detail, but I think it's very important to see how a false confession could be obtained and how DNA has done a lot of good work in finding people who weren't involved with the crime, who have been convicted, and liberating them and giving them their lives back. Also in the vein of like history, I read The Cancer Factory. This was actually also an audiobook. This was by Jim Morris. The Cancer Factory discussed Goodyear and another factory, DuPont, and how the chemicals that they willingly exposed their workers to, and even beyond when they knew it was going to cause their workers harm. These workers have a much higher than average rate of bladder cancer, which I wonder where that came from. The main chemical discussed was orthotoluidine, and also the role it played not just in the workers who worked at the plant, but also the women who they went home to and had children with, the cause of a lot of birth defects in women, or believed to be. Lawyers, of course, are disputing this, and I found a lot of similarities between this book and A Soul Full of Coal Dust, which described the I almost want to say asbestos. I'm getting to asbestos. Black lung in coal workers in Appalachia, but a lot of people, or a couple people, 2 people, commented on my video and mentioned that there was also a lot of connection to asbestos and workers who were exposed to asbestos, and I think that is also very, very true, and I think that's a very good connection to make if you read this book at well. It's fascinating, but I feel like in ways it's very predictable. That's not like a bad thing or a critique, but I mean, you know the beats the lawyers are going to go through, you know how the companies are going to react. I mean, it's workers are kind of being put in harm's way because a company doesn't want to pay the safety mitigation costs to take care of the chemical. That's basically what happened. Next up, Arbitrary Lines by Nolan Gray. This was a book that described zoning and its impact on the American city. Interesting, but I wanted more case studies in this book, and it was more of a popular read, and the author was kind of avoiding case studies, and I think case studies would have been the way to go in this book. And finally, Linguistics, A Short Introduction, another book that just performed way better than expected on my channel, but I'm going to take it. I thought it was an absolutely fascinating read, and I had several people leave very detailed comments with a lot of information. It's one of those books you read and then have more questions when you end than you started with, but I think that's a good thing. It's what I see a lot in my nonfiction reading. One book will spawn 30 or 40 questions, which I then need to track down answers to. Some answers that can be achieved easily online, some which are going to require, at least for me, reading another book. So going into May, I think I'm swinging back to maybe reading more fiction. I'm not sure. I have a number of fiction books out. I would like to get back on track with reading my Hugo Award winners and finalists. Those early years in that reading challenge are quite difficult to find. A lot of them are out of print, and my library messed up my interlibrary hold account, so I'm gonna have to get that sorted out before I can place more interlibrary holds. But I think I'm going to get back on the fiction train. I think I'm probably going to read fewer books even than I did in April, and that is to be expected. We're moving into one of the warmer months. I live in an area that gets quite cold and disgusting in the winter. Not disgusting. I don't like to hate on winter. Winter has its place. But when it's warm and when there's a lot of sunshine where I live, I love to get outside. I love playing sports. I love being active outdoors when it's really nice. So I don't know if I'm going to read as much in May as I did in April, but we're going to try. I like to devote some time every single evening to reading, and I can get through quite a bit. I have a lot of exciting books checked out, and I'm excited to continue to bring you guys book reviews. If you want to share how you read in April, how much you read, what you thought about, and books that you want to read in the coming month, please put it in the comment section down below. I love getting all of your comments, and I read them and respond to them eventually. So please leave your comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great